ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
So it was in February 2016 and I just came down from upstairs and Dad said to Mum and I've lost all the money. And it, like, what? Like, it didn't make any sense. We didn't know that, like, anything. We didn't even know that he was investing or that anything was happening. And, you know, and he was super upset and didn't sort of want to say too much about it. And I was, like, worried that he was going to die. Like, it was just atrocious and, like, super upsetting and super confusing. Well, like, I don't know, had he been investing in a real company? It seemed like a real company to start with. Yeah, it was everything that they had in their savings.
David Sweeney is a fighter, which is lucky for his father, who was duped out of his entire life savings by scammers. After a battle spanning years, David got the money back. But so many other Australians aren't so lucky. So what's the government doing about it? And is it putting enough onus on the banks to protect our funds? Today, investigative reporter Adele Ferguson on David's story and a model which could really help to protect your savings. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Adele, I want you to tell me about David Sweeney and his father because you've been speaking to him about a pretty horrifying case of online scammers and how they really went for his father and took a lot of money.
Yeah, so David Sweeney's father is 89 years old. He sold the house and had $1 million. And he started to get contacted by Option FM, which was an online trading company. They spent 52 hours speaking to him through Skype and really manipulated him.
He was just looking to invest and have someone help him to know how to invest. But there was about 50 hours of Skype conversations, endless emails and texts and whatever. And they really got Dad trying to understand their system, which was just a fraud. But that really confused him. And then they put him through another couple of months of supposed trading where they walked him through each trade. They were on Skype calls all the time.
He ended up depositing $1 million and realised it was a complete fraud.
They had really done quite a number on him. So there had been a couple of months of them getting him to transfer the money and progressively putting more money in with the hope of getting more help from them.
So then David got involved because he was absolutely gutted, devastated, emotionally drained.
Yes.
Just really devastated the family.
And by the end of that, he had lost a lot of weight. He wasn't sleeping. It took a good few months for him to be even vaguely normal again, and maybe a year or so to just not be completely shattered.
Yeah, that moment when they realised that it was a scam, I can't imagine how that would feel.
It was their life savings.
Yeah.
So David, the son, gets involved and starts writing to the banks.
That was something like a year of work to just, give 3 banks the information they need and keep up with them and back and forth.
And he's writing and he's writing and he's saying that he's getting gaslit. So he was getting nowhere.
We sort of kept on pushing them and they were continually just telling us, your dad authorised these transactions. There's nothing that can happen. It's not our responsibility. We're not meant to know about crime.
And then he decided to do an FOI to ASIC to see if a letter had ever been written to the banks.
And then I actually did get an email about the company that Dad lost the money to from ASIC, and that was the bit where it turned round.
He does an FOI and gets this letter in 2020, which the banks had written in 2015, which was months before his father had entered this scam. And the letter said, Option FM is a cold scam. What we want you to do, banks, is put in place processes to make sure that you're blocking them. And also, it would be a good idea to contact any customers that have been putting money with Option FM.
So through a Freedom of Information request, he finds out that the banks actually know that Option FM is out there and is scamming people before his father was scammed.
That's right, 4 months before his father was scammed. And they should have done something about it, and they hadn't. So he had them on the hook.
So then I took that email to the banks, which was a whole process in itself, because they didn't make it easy to communicate with them. First, they hadn't seen it and it wasn't a thing, and it wasn't interesting to them, and it was the same stuff I'd talked about. They were mostly pretty sick of hearing about me.
So he sent the letter off to them in 2020. So this is 5 years after he'd been writing to them, and they had to put up the white flag and pay the father back.
Oh my gosh. So for 5 years, David is writing to the bank saying we need to get this money back. 5 years is such a long fight, but they win.
But they win. So 3 banks had to pay him back 100% of the money that he'd lost.
Wow.
The father, he's just still so embarrassed. He's gone through hell. He's still suffering. He's got health conditions. So he didn't want to be named.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's absolutely fair enough. So, Adele, I just want you to remind me of the figures, because David and his father, their story is just one of thousands.
Absolutely. According to the ACCC, online scams cost Australians $2.7 billion a year, and there are more than 600,000 victims who report them a year. But it's actually much worse than that. The regulator thinks there's at least 30% more people who just don't report.
Yeah, so it's an absolutely massive problem. So let's look now then, Adele, at what the government is actually doing to address this, because it is such a big problem for our country, a huge social problem. Last week, it did release a draft bill called the Scams Prevention Framework. What is that?
Yeah, so it's all in the name. It's a prevention framework, and it covers the banks, social media platforms and telcos, because they're all involved in enabling scammers to operate. But the banks are the key point. 100% of them have to go through banks, whereas it's about 17% that go through the other platforms. And so this draft bill will cover all of them, and it's about prevention and detection rather than compensating customers. And there'll be a code of conduct for each of the industries, which have yet to have the details released. They're still getting written up by Treasury, and the Minister will have to approve them, and that could take a long time. And there will also be fines. So if there are any of these big industry players who aren't doing the right thing, they're not putting in place the right processes, they'll be fined up to $50 million.
Okay, so the Minister for Financial Services, Stephen Jones, says this is really about stopping the scams before they actually happen. That's the whole point of it.
Look, this is a major uplift in our protections for Australians against scammers. Tough new obligations on banks, on telecommunications companies, on social media companies to prevent, to detect, to disrupt and to report and to respond to scam content within their businesses.
That is what he's saying. It's really hard to stop them before they happen, because these scammers, especially with artificial intelligence, they're going to be able to find ways around it. So you're never going to stop them, but you can certainly curb them.
Okay, all right. So, Adele, this draft bill, it has received a lot of feedback. Consumer advocacy groups like Choice say it really just doesn't go far enough because it doesn't address the reimbursement of people who have been scammed by the banks.
That's absolutely correct. So the consumer advocacy groups say it's great that we're actually addressing the problem and that we're going to be putting in place preventions and that all of the industry players are going to be on the hook. But the one gap in it, and it's a big gap, is it doesn't cover reimbursement, which is what happens in the UK.
So just tell me about the model in the UK.
So in the UK, in 2019, there was a voluntary reimbursement model that most of the big banks signed up to. And what it was is if there was a scam, then they would pay back the customer. And so what happened with that, it became really effective because the banks started to fix the systems because they didn't want to be on the hook. And if you have a look at the figures, it's actually worked because in 2023, £460 million of payback was detected versus $2.7 billion in Australia.
Interesting. Yeah, I can actually remember quite some years ago, maybe 20 years ago, I was scammed and my bank did give me the money back. I mean, the bank dealt with it, but obviously it's become such a huge problem that banks don't want to do that anymore here.
Yeah, so there are stats on that too. So ASIC released a report last year. It went to the big four banks and it found that between 2 and 4% is repaid in compensation to customers. So they repaid about $21 million, which is peanuts.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, but just tell me then, Adele, why won't the government bring in a model similar to what they have in the UK? Because that does seem a lot fairer for the consumer that's being ripped off.
It does. And the UK is actually introducing a mandatory model. So it's been voluntary since 2019 and a mandatory model is coming this year. So what the Australian government is saying, and Minister Jones, is saying that Australia will become a honeypot for scammers.
If you have a situation where it doesn't matter whether you were negligent or not, the bank always pays, that is a nirvana for criminals. They'll say, let's go to Australia because it's a victimless crime. The bank always pays. Who cares? Banks are wealthy.
But that's not the evidence in the UK.
It's not. And I think if you listen to the stories of people who've been scammed, they're emotionally drained because some of them have been spoken to and dudded. You know, they've been manipulated emotionally. Some of the romance scams where people really fall heavily in love and pay up money, and it's a fraud. So I don't think people are going to throw caution to the wind. It's known as the moral hazard argument. And the banks have used that many times over the years when it comes to compensation. And it just seems that the government has really listened to this form of an argument.
Yeah. All right. Well, Adele, we know, of course, that online scams are becoming more and more sophisticated. That's why more and more of us are falling for them. Do we have any indication, any data to suggest to us how bad this could actually get?
We don't. What we do know is, if you look at the UK model, when there is prevention and there is proper compensation, it is falling. It continued to fall last year, and it's starting to fall in Australia. It fell 13% because they are putting in place some measures. But ASIC's report last year, when it looked at the big four banks, it said its overall approach to scam strategy was highly variable, less mature than expected, and they had inconsistent and narrow approaches to determining liability. So I really think consumers deserve more. There's a lot of different types of scams that are being invented, and not everybody is like David, who spent years fighting the banks to get the money back.
Adele Ferguson is an investigative reporter at the ABC. This episode was produced by Cara Jensen-McKinnon and Sydney Peed. Audio production by Sam Dunn and Anna John. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.